Hello, this is Glenn Loury at The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv. I'm sitting here with James Forman, professor of law at Yale Law School, and also the author of Locking Up Our Own, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the ways in which African-American leaders dealt with the rising crime and drug problems in Washington, D.C. in the 1960s and 1970s. So welcome, James.
Thank you, thank you.
The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, I want the audience to know, is sponsored in part by the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs here at Brown University, where I am at a faculty affiliate. And we're here to talk about the book. Congratulations, James, on winning the Pulitzer Prize. That's amazing, man.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's well deserved, but I mean, that's you are one of the very few Pulitzer Prize winners I've had the pleasure of speaking with for face to face.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. I mean, everybody in my family was all hyped up on that day that it happened, and the one person who could really actually care less was my son, Emeka, who's 9 years old. And when we came home, my mom actually happened to be in town that day, and it's a total, there's no warning, there's no short list, there's no nothing. You just get a call absolutely out of the blue.
Wow.
You find out actually when the world finds out. They don't even call you in advance. So
wow.
When they make the announcement, you learn. And I went home that day, and I saw my family, and my son just couldn't care less. And then I pulled up the list of winners, and the way they organized the list, general nonfiction is right next to music. And so music was Kendrick Lamar, of course, famously. So I show him this screenshot of me next to Kendrick Lamar, and he's like, he pauses, and he's like, oh, wow, this is for real. You must be important. And then he's like, so are we rich? And I'm like, no, we're not rich.
That's funny, man. So this 9-year-old knows who Kendrick Lamar is.
Unfortunately. I mean, in the sense that when I say unfortunately, I mean that there's a lot of language in a lot of the music that he and his friends, listen to, and we do our best. I like some of the themes of the music, but there's just words and language that's problematic for that age, and it's real hard to get clean versions.
So he's picking up from his peers. It's not like he's hearing you play this stuff at home.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. No,
Okay.
My station is classic jazz, which just drives him crazy.
That's old school, man.
Yeah,
That's
man.
too tired. It's slow.
Exactly.
It's not what's happening.
Exactly.
All right, locking up our own. This is a book that examines how various actors in the African American community dealt with rising crime problems at a critical point when the mass incarceration trend was just getting started in the late 60s and 70s. How did you come to focus on that topic, and why do you think the book has been so well received?
I don't know about the well-received question necessarily, but I wanted to focus on it because I felt like there were so many accounts of what has happened over the last 40 or 50 years, but in most of those accounts, Black voices have been almost entirely absent. So before I had anything on the page, I had a small whiteboard in my office, and on the whiteboard, it said African American agency, African American leadership at the top. And then it had categories: police, prosecutors, judges, politicians, activists. And all I knew was that I wanted to write about those people. I wanted to center those voices. I wanted to get into those debates. I've been hearing those debates since I was a child growing up in Atlanta, and then as a practicing lawyer in DC. I knew there was wildly divergent opinions and perspectives. I was reading Black intellectuals in the 80s and the 90s. I was reading arguments that people were having about, including arguments that you were a part of, about, well, what's the best way to protect our community in this time of crisis? And I knew that that story had never been fully and richly told. It was like often reduced to, be like a caricature or sort of, there's this position or that position, but I wanted to tell the whole story in a historic, or, as much of the whole story, you never can tell the whole story, but I wanted to tell more of the story and really ground it in a particular community. And Washington, D.C., with its Black political class and majority Black constituency, seemed like a great place to do it.
Okay, so we've got a crisis in the cities. We've got heroin, we've got cocaine, we've got violence. We got a rise in crime. This is an alarming development. It has real detrimental impacts on the lives of people who are living in these communities. What were the main features of the leadership class in Washington, D.C.'s response in these years to these developments, the African American judges, politicians, activists, prosecutors, and so on? How did they get their heads around what was happening? What did they think was happening? And how did they determine to respond to it?
Yeah. So if I had to sum up the response, it's hard to sum it up in one or two words, but I would say that it was predominantly punitive. It was predominantly kind of tough in its response. But now to say kind of more about that. So you have a community, right? And you mentioned it. So in the 1960s, we have this massive increase in heroin and the impact that it's having on the black community. In DC, the percentage of people in the jail who are considered heroin addicts goes from 4% in the early 1960s to 45% by the late 1960s, right? And that's an epidemic. You have homicide. Homicide doubles in this country in the 1960s. It tripled in Washington, D.C. It more than doubled. It's not normal or healthy or plausible in a community to have the homicide rate double in a decade. And so these things are happening, and at the same time, black constituents for the first time are starting to be able to elect black representatives to local government. There's an 800% increase in black elected officials nationwide in the 70s and 80s, mainly because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now it's 800% increase over
zero, practically.
Exactly, over almost zero, but it's understood and perceived at the time, and there's lots of articles and papers and magazines documenting and talking about, we finally have some people in office and some numbers. Now, who are these people, right? That's the people that are coming into office are this first generation of African American political leaders to take these positions. A lot of them all of them remember the long history of under enforcement and under protection of the law, right? That has been part of the black experience since slavery. This idea that complaints by black citizens don't get investigated. They don't get a law enforcement response. So you have crime rising, you have black citizens beginning to complain, you have them complaining to black leaders, you have those black leaders who remember the history of nobody ever listening to those complaints. So they come into office, at least some of them, really bound and determined to try to respond to those citizen complaints. Now, what do they do, in response? Overwhelmingly, or I would say disproportionately, they start to adopt the same set of policy responses that criminalization, longer sentences, mandatory minimums, aggressive policing, stop and frisk, pretext stops, collateral consequences, a lot of the same responses that the nation is starting to adopt at that same time. In their kind of partial defense, I would say.
They need defense? Do they need to be defended for adopting a tough, punitive posture in the face of what was threatening their community?
When I say in their defense, I don't come at it from a standpoint of feeling like they need to be defended. I guess maybe the better way to put it is not in their defense, but now to tell more of the story, okay. Right? I started with one line and expanding out, and then to tell more of the story, which I think is part of the true history. Maybe okay. That's the way to put it. Alongside these embrace of these punitive responses, many of them, not all, are also asking for the larger society. They have limited, right? They're managing mostly declining cities. Yeah. At the time. And so they're going to Congress, which is the only place that has real resources.
And it's Washington, D.C., so they don't go to the governor's mansion.
Right, but in Atlanta, they're going to the governor's mansion and to Congress. In Chicago, they're going to the governor's mansion, and so it is a DC-focused story, but there's also,
this is going on in
a lot of other places. And so they're going to the governor's mansion or to Congress, which is where the real money is for this kind of massive investment that I'm now about to describe. And they're asking for a whole set of additional funds and resources for other ways of responding to the problem alongside the one that they are endorsing. So they're asking for more money for schools and for jobs and for housing and for health care. They're asking for funding for drug treatment. And the basic summation of the story is they don't get much of that. In fact, we see declining public investment in the 80s, especially in the Reagan years, in those kinds of programs. So they have this sort of package of requests. They get the money for one. The mistake that I think that they made is that they continued to embrace, they got into this pattern where they kept asking for this whole package. They kept accepting the punitive approach, and not until more or less today, or the last 5 years, I would say, have people started to say, wait a minute, on its own terms, many of these punitive responses that we've been endorsing have actually been more destructive than they have been beneficial. So we don't even want to have them as part of the package.
Okay, so these black elites were not without deep concern about the broader welfare of their communities, not just fighting crime. They understood that progressive policies that expanded opportunity for the poor people who were their constituents were, at the end of the day, the most fundamental effective response to the crime problem. But they were unable to get their hands on the resources needed to undertake a more holistic response. They ended up pretty much concentrating on the punitive response. And you can have some, in retrospect, understanding about how they got to that point. But still, I'm asking you now, this is all an extended question. It's regrettable at the end of the day that that's the way things played out.
I think so. I mean, fundamentally, I think the book is a tragedy. I thought about having that word in the title for a long time. Tragedy or tragic was going to be in the title of the book. So yes, I do think that. Now, we're obviously generalizing, right? And so we're talking about a class of people, a group of people, and there are lots of variation. A lot of variation. Yeah. And so there are some folks that I don't think necessarily shared that concern, that the way that I've been describing it and that you've characterized it based on my description. There are some folks that just had a hard edge. There are some folks that viewed these as, lower class thugs, hoodlums that just cannot get along with the program, and we just got to cut you out because you're just hurting us, the black community, right? So there's a class story that's also in my narrative. I don't think this is true of everybody, but I do think that there are a number of folks where you can see, it's very hard to get inside somebody's head, right? So you have to analyze the language that they use and some of the choices that they make. But I think that you see people that do have this attitude that says, you're just hurting us, you're just hurting the community, and I don't have any excuse for you. I suffered from these same obstacles that you're suffering from, or my father, my mother suffered from them, and they didn't turn to selling drugs, and they didn't turn to thugging, and they didn't turn to running the streets. Yeah. And so there's that's a piece of the story as well. Yeah.
Now you have a personal history in D.C. in the law enforcement area, do you not?
I was a public defender. Yes. You said
it made it sound like you were a police officer.
Yeah, I immediately thought, well, I was never a police officer.
I meant that you have some stories to tell based on your own personal experience about what happened with you, with your clients, and so forth. Why don't you tell us one of those stories that you think the audience would really benefit from hearing?
Oh, absolutely. I often tell a story about a young man I represented by the name of Brandon, a teenage client. But I think I'll tell maybe a different story. That's one of the stories in the book, but and we've talked about that story in the past. But maybe I'll talk about another person that I represented, a woman named Tasha Willis. And I changed all the names. So these are real stories. It happened just like this, but the names have changed. And so Tasha Willis was, would have been early 1990s, and she was a client of mine, and she had been charged with selling heroin. And it was a small, $20 worth street sale. She had a prior conviction for selling heroin. And what that meant was, under DC law, that the maximum sentence that she faced, because DC law doesn't draw any distinctions based on the amount of the sale. So you can face 30 years for the first sale And then if you have a prior conviction, you can face 60 years for the second sale. Now, people don't get 30 years or 60 years, but that is the maximum sentence. And when you sit down with your client, you have to explain to them that that is possible, right? That could happen. You also tell them that it doesn't, you've never seen it happen. But every once in a while, not 30 or 60, but we saw cases of 10 or 15 years. Again, not that common, particularly for a first or a second
For that
offense,
kind of small quantity.
For that kind of small quantity, but it can happen.
Okay.
So you have to advise your client that, right? Because they're often deciding whether to take a plea offer. So I'm telling Ms. Willis about this. And she had been worked in the post office earlier in her life. She had suffered an injury. She had been given opioid prescription medication. She had eventually developed an addiction. She has started using heroin. So it was a very kind of common and classic story, a classic descent. But now here she was, and she was trying to recover. She was trying to get free. And her plea offer from the government was 5 years because she had this prior record. And from the government's perspective, well, that's a big discount because you could get 60.
Right.
So you take the plea, and we didn't have a factual defense. I mean, we didn't, the police officer was there, the police reports were solidly put together. She wasn't arguing that it didn't happen.
She was going to be found
guilty. She was just saying she was going to be found guilty. So I go to meet the prosecutor, and I explained to her, because Ms. Willis wants to get into a treatment program. And I'm sitting down with the prosecutor, African-American woman, and most of the prosecutors, I should say, are not African-American. In this story of kind of black actors throughout the system, the one group that was still disproportionately white was the prosecutor's office. But this particular prosecutor happened to be African-American. And I had worked with her before, and I liked her. She was what we call one of the good ones. And so I talked to Bernice and I said, listen, I told her my client's story and how she became addicted and how she was taking care of her mother, and if she were locked up for 5 years, not only would it be her, but it would be her family that would suffer. And couldn't she offer a treatment program? She looked through the file, and she looked up and she shook her head and she said, no, we can't do it, we can't do it. And she said, my office won't approve it. And
because of the prior conviction?
Because of the prior conviction. And not the prior conviction specifically, that she had been offered a treatment program previously and failed out. And I was so upset about that because of what we all know, what all the research literature suggests, which is that people often need multiple attempts to rehabilitation and at recovery, and everybody who has a loved one in their family, right, who is suffering from addiction knows this, and our initial instincts for our loved ones is to try to figure out how we can get them that second and that third and that fourth chance.
The reason I'm smiling is because keep coming back was the refrain that I used to always hear at the AA meetings that I was going to in the 1980s because I had a substance problem myself. Keep coming back because you break out, you relapse. This is just a part of recovery. This is a fact.
But her position was, the office's position was, they basically kind of almost institutionally took a blind eye to that reality, which I think they would have to have admitted at some level. I think that she knew that, but they didn't allow themselves to be open to that. And she just took the position of, well, she's had this opportunity. And I sort of lost my cool, and I said to her, how come we never have that attitude about prison? How come we never say, well, prison didn't work the first time, so we're not going to try prison the next time, right? We never hold prison up to any, and this is one of the points that I try to make through telling this story, is that we don't ask of prison really any of the questions that we typically ask of non-prison alternatives, right? We don't demand cost-effectiveness studies. We don't demand efficacy studies. It's just the default, and then anything else you do, the job training program, the drug treatment program, the alternative, the housing first program, all those other things have to be defended with very rigorous analysis But prison is just what we turn to.
Well, because those other things have the premise that they're going to produce a certain outcome, and one could argue that for some people, the desirable outcome from prison is imposing punishment upon the inmate, which prison does. It confines the inmate, and they ain't worried. That is their bottom line. It produced 100% exactly what we wanted it to produce. It confined that person for 30 years. But it's a fair point. Should that be the only thing that we want from prison, is to simply punish the people who are in there, given the vast expanse of this institution and the expense that it is required and the impact on people's lives? Should we be asking for more from prison than simply removing somebody from the population? I think
Right.
the answer is yes.
And I think, especially in the case of somebody like a Tasha Willis, who
Yeah.
even by the terms of the government, she sold $20 worth of heroin twice, right? That person in particular, who I'm not arguing is the
Yeah.
modal person in our prison system,
Yeah.
but that person, I think it's hard to justify, 5 years times $50,000.
What happened in Tasha's case?
So she did not take the plea. And she said, I think you're going to find a way to beat it. And the case sort of kind of worked its way through, and I see her so we show up for the trial date. And I saw her outside in the courtroom, and I was really worried about her because when I had seen her previously, she had been very together. But now on the trial date, she looked a little sleepy. I was worried that the judge might think, based on her presentation, or the prosecutor might think that maybe she had gone back to using. But the case is called, and we go up there, and the government is always asked, the court says to the government, are you ready to proceed? And if the government says no, it means something happened with their case. You never know why. And so the government said not ready, and I moved to dismiss, it's like almost a play. The government says not ready. The judge looks at the defense says we move to dismiss for want of prosecution. They're not ready. Motion is granted, and you walk out the door.
Wow.
I don't know what happened.
She could have taken that plea and had to serve 3 years.
That's right. And I still don't know, and in those cases you never know. Did Bernice Lester
Have
deep sickness, change of heart? She wasn't in court that day. She did do something in the file to have a change of heart? Did she not send the notice to the arresting officer to come to court that day? So then the arresting officer
sabotaged their own case.
Or who knows why? Or you never know.
I see.
Never know why they're not ready.
And you never saw this prosecutor again to ask that question?
I did see her, but I didn't want to ask it. And when I saw Ms. Willis in the hallway afterwards, the last exchange that we had was, she said, I was worried about her because I knew that her only hope, the only kind of drug treatment we do have, not that was being offered in this case, but that we have now exists for poor people overwhelmingly is through the court system, right? Which is also one of the problems, is if you're gonna get help, it's mostly through the criminal justice system because we don't have adequate funding of the public health network that would allow her to get access to these programs outside of it. So I also knew that as the case was being dismissed, she was avoiding prison, but she was also losing any hope that she was ever gonna be able to have of treatment. I was worried about her, and she looked at me and she said, don't worry, Mr. Forman. She could tell I was worried. She said, don't worry, I'm gonna be okay. And she left.
Okay, so I want to ask a political kind of question now. It occurs to me that in the years, between 1968 and 1992, between the end of the Johnson administration and the election of Clinton, there was a Democratic president only 4 years out of that period. That was Jimmy Carter's 76 to 80. There was 2 terms of Nixon, there were 2 terms of Reagan, and there was George Herbert Walker Bush. And during that period, this is a period when you see this rapid increase in the level of incarceration in the country, and you see the political rhetoric become a much more punitive, law and order type rhetoric. States are passing, a lot of mandatory minimums, and people are locking them up and throwing away the key. The Willie Horton ad during the 1988 campaign was a kind of capstone on this whole thing. Law and order. How did these elites, African American elites in cities like Washington, D.C., while they were carrying out a relatively punitive response to the crime problem in their own cities, relate to the larger rhetoric, political rhetoric in the country around law and order issues? Did they identify with it? Were they conscious of the fact that their actions may have been in some way or another legitimating this more punitive tone in the national political discourse? How did they situate themselves vis-a-vis the national discussion?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't have that much an account of that, in the book, and I'm trying to now think about, the sort of pieces of evidence that I do have to draw on that. I guess my general view or my general perspective is that most of the conversation was at the local level was about local criminal justice policy, remained relatively local. So you have kind of national civil rights leaders who were Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and NAACP and folks like that who would offer critiques of the Reagan administration and war on drugs and Willie Horton, but the local elected officials tended to be more kind of focused on the bread and butter local government politics and policy questions. And I don't recall a lot of back and forth discussion of them sort of offering commentary on these things that you're describing. What I can recall is that it somewhat depended on obviously of the specifics and of the individual, but certainly in the 1980s, for example, when you have these Republican presidents who, it should be noted, with Democratic majorities in the House all these years that we're talking about, there's a Democratic House. The whole notion of there being a Republican majority House is a relatively recent one. So there's a Democrat. I can't actually remember the composition of the Senate in all of these years, but the House, the Speaker of the House is Tip O'Neill for much of this time that we're talking about. And so a lot of what's being passed through Congress is, at least at some level, bipartisan consensus. Now, there may be Democrats that are being kind of, Willie Horton, this would be the Bill Clinton story. You never know whether he really believed it or not, or whether he was just pushed there politically because he wanted to be president, and so he saw what happened to Dukakis. So it's always a little bit hard to know, are people's actions, were the Democrats' positions during these years the things that they arrived themselves because they thought they were right, or things that they were pushed to politically because it's what they needed to do to win? I don't have a great, I'm not sure of that, but I think that the black political leadership, especially in the crack years, is saying things like, bring the National Guard. In the late 80s, they're saying in Atlanta, in DC and in Detroit and in Chicago, there are folks that are saying we would welcome the National Guard. William Raspberry, the African-American Washington Post columnist, late William Raspberry, who's a giant figure in these years, you can see the tension in his writing. He goes back and forth. He'll have a column one week that has this sense of compassion for the drug user, the person who's on crack, who needs our help, and it's like, and then there's a horrific shooting, and the next week he's quoting, he's pushing for the National Guard to come to town. And I feel like that kind of tension, so many people were under during these 2 decades.
Yeah, I knew Bill Raspberry. He was a good friend of Bob Woodson, who's a good friend of mine. I don't know if you know Woodson National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, who's another one of these figures. I mean, Woodson's probably a Republican, not a Democrat, but he's a very moderate guy. He's a community-focused guy, and he's kind of, on the one hand, lock him up and throw away the key can't be the answer, but on the other hand, man, we're sweeping up the mess here. There are dead bodies lying in the street. Somebody's house just got broken. They just got carjacked. They got pistol whipped. These are people he knows. I know this person.
Right. Carl Rowan. I don't know if
he
is if he was part of this. If you knew him as well.
I did not know Carl Rowan.
Okay, so he writes again
very
another
prominent columnist for the Washington Post.
Exactly, African American columnist, and he writes a column, the title of which is the title of chapter 4 of my book, "Locking Up Thugs is Not Vindictive," And actually his column, now that I'm thinking about it, is a little bit of a response to your question about where people are situating themselves.
Yeah.
Because the column begins by making reference to some of the national political dialogue, the sort of tough on crime posture that some national Republican leaders are taking.
Yeah.
And he says, that's wrong. And some of that is racist. And I don't embrace that. He says, but we also have to understand that our communities are being terrorized. And he then describes some of that terror, and he says, so locking up thugs, I'm not vindictive. He says, I'm not vindictive. I'm not like Reagan. But locking up thugs is not vindictive. It's where he kind of ends.
Yeah. Okay, how about if I ask you to reflect a little bit on some of the contemporary policy and political issues, because we do have the movement Black Lives Matter out there that has brought attention to unjustified police violence as an issue and victimization of African Americans. At the same time, we also have, it should be said, crime is down in the present day relative to the levels that it had reached during the 1980s and 1990s. Homicide is down, even amongst African Americans, again, relative to the peak in the 1990s. But it has, it seems, spiked a bit in the last few years, and in some cities it's a very serious problem. It's a serious problem in Chicago, it's a serious problem in St. Louis, serious problem in Baltimore and other places. There are African American leaders and liberal democratic leaders in power in some of these places. Did we learn anything, do you think, from your study of the history of Washington, D.C. that bears on how it is that progressively oriented and minority leaders in contemporary American cities ought to respond or are responding to serious threats of public safety to African American communities in those cities?
I think we've learned a lot, and I think that a lot at the ground level, and it's hard to notice this because there's so much attention to sort of national discourse and President Trump and now former Attorney General Sessions, who are kind of continuing the fear-mongering and some of this race baiting on criminal justice issues, mainly focused on immigration, to a much lesser extent focused on kind of the things that motivated the Bush and Reagan. But beneath that, if you go down to the community level, I mean, I just came from Chicago, and I did an event with Arnie Duncan, who has gone back to Chicago.
Former Secretary of Education, who had been Director of Superintendent of Schools in Chicago before he joined the Obama administration.
That's exactly right. And he has started this organization called Chicago CRED, and C-R-E-D, and I can't remember what it stands for, but it's something about community and economic development. But and I did an event, and the chief prosecutor, Kim Fox, who's a reform-minded prosecutor, African-American prosecutor who was elected in Chicago, and so we should talk about the prosecutor elections, but she's there. There's a couple hundred folks in the room, a lot of local leadership, a lot of law enforcement.
Yeah.
And this program is a program focused on, the mission of the program is young people in Chicago who are likely to be shot or to be shooters. And many of them are there. Graduates of the program are there, and current members of the program are there. And it's a program that combines mentoring, it combines job training. It's many of the leaders on the ground are graduates of the program, and everybody, that the basic theory of the program is that folks need to be trained, to be mentored, to be given a set of life skills, to be given a real alternative path. But here's one of the crucial pieces of it. They need to be paid and supported while they're in the training program itself. Because one of the things that has happened now is some of these communities, there's so little sense of belief that any of these programs that actually exist are really going to pay off, because you don't see your mother or father going to that job, that factory is gone. And so people enter into a program, but they give up because they're still desperately poor. And so what this program says is we're going to support you economically while you're in the program. So we're going to make it both viable for you to stay in this program as opposed to being on the streets or selling drugs or whatever. But also that economic viability is a marker. It's saying this job that we're training you for, that we've identified, we can point to it. It's not a theory of a job, it's an actual job that you can look at. That pathway is a real one, and one of the ways you know that it is real is that we're supporting you economically right now while you're in this program. And so it's very powerful, and I talked to a bunch of the young men that were there, and it was quite amazing. I never saw anything like this in the 80s and 90s, where you've got guys from communities that are suffering from violence, and when you talk to them, you can tell this isn't go into the hood and take the kid with like the shiniest test scores and put them into the prep school. I mean, they are talking to guys that are in it.
There's some tough cases in there.
Yeah. And the law enforcement apparatus and the political apparatus and the foundation apparatus, people are wrapping their arms around these guys and really trying to build a second chance for them. And a bunch of them are succeeding. That's a kind of community-based, I think it's the kind of thing that you talked about Rob Woodson.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that he would say. If you were in D.C., he's still in D.C.?
Yeah, he's in D.C.
He'd be at that meeting.
He has connections all over the country, and he may know something about what's going on in Chicago.
So I guess I feel like at the local level, in these cities like in Chicago, in Baltimore, they're bringing in a program called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, which started out of Seattle. But what this program does is it empowers law enforcement officers who encounter addicts, people like Tasha Willis, selling small amounts on the street, empowers them to take them directly to treatment programs. So the officer, it used to be that an officer would make an arrest, and at best you might get handed a phone number that says, well, you can call this number for treatment, and then there's a 9-month waiting list. So I think in some of these highest crime communities that we are seeing, we do have a lot of lessons in learning. Now I've given you the good news. They also tried to pass a bunch of new mandatory minimums in Maryland last year in response to this crime. So there's some ways in which we haven't learned, but I think the balance that I see on the community level is to try to respond, to understand that it's a crisis, it's still a crisis, but to respond to it differently than we did in previous generations.
I see. You mentioned prosecutor elections. What did you want to say about that?
Well, to me, I think this is one of the most exciting things that's happening right now in this country on criminal justice reform, because starting in November 2016, the same election that brought President Trump, that's at a local level around the country. There were a whole series of progressive prosecutors, people in local communities who ran on it used to be that to be elected prosecutor, you had to say, I'm going to lock up more people for longer and keep them in harsher conditions.
Yeah.
And starting 2 years ago and continuing to just Tuesday, where we saw it happen in St. Louis, we saw it happen in Boston, we saw it happen in Dallas, people are running on campaigns that say, these are prosecutors now. Mass incarceration is a moral issue. I'm not going to ask for money bonds for poor people who can't afford to pay. I'm not going to prosecute low-level drug offenses. Which means they'll be
released on their own recognizance prior to trial.
Yes, which is what happens in lots of places right now, but there's still a whole bunch of places that don't do it, and so they're pushing back on that. They're saying, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia has told his prosecutors, when you go to court, you ask for a prison sentence, you have to put on the record the amount that it costs to incarcerate somebody in the state of Pennsylvania, times the number of years, and then explain and argue to the judge why it's worth it. And that then starts to hold prison up. Earlier we were talking about, well, why don't we ask the efficacy questions about prison? Well, once you start to do that, you introduce that as a concept, because then somebody can say, well, hey, here's this alternative. Now let's compare the two. How should we spend our $200,000? So this is a movement that you mentioned Black Lives Matter. One of the interesting things to me is that in a lot of these cities, local activists, Black Lives Matter and other, have noticed that they can make a difference in these prosecutor races. And there's been some raging debates. In Philadelphia, a bunch of the abolitionists said, wait a minute, should we get behind a reformer DA? Because he's still going to ask people to be locked up. And we don't believe there should be prisons, right? We're prison abolitionists, so should we support this candidacy? And the bulk of them ultimately decided that it was worth doing because their long goal is to get rid of prisons, but along the way, you got to take some specific steps to at least reduce the size until you're going to get the way. If you have 5,000 people in the Philadelphia jail today, and you want to get to zero, well, you're going to have to get to 4,000 before you get to zero. And Larry Krasner is going to help you do that.
Very interesting. Well, James Forman, thanks for joining us here, The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I've been with James Forman, professor of law at Yale Law School and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Locking Up Our Own. Really appreciate your time, James.
Thank you, man. It's an honor.